The crucial part of de-psychopathologization that I think most people miss is because they framed the trans identity as healthy, when clearly it's the result of a psychiatric condition. But they reframed this mental illness as a perfectly healthy identity, which is dangerous in and of itself, because anyone who is suffering from a mental illness is not well served by everyone pretending that they're perfectly healthy. But the other crucial part is when they reframed it as healthy, they made it not only possible to celebrate it, but because trans activism is so aggressive in its approach, they made it mandatory that we celebrate it. WPATH shifted that. They forced everyone to celebrate it, and I believe that's what triggered the social contagion. Then the idea lands into the minds of young people, and these young people are not identifying as having a psychiatric disorder, they're not identifying as having gender dysphoria, they're not identifying as having autogynephilia, they're identifying as trans, and trans is the healthy identity.
You must be some kind of therapist?
Today I have the pleasure of welcoming back to the show Mia Hughes, who I like to think of as Mia Phonebook Hughes on account of my favorite comment from our last episode where someone said I could listen to her read the phone book. So in addition to being a brilliant thinker, she's also very pleasant to listen to. She probably needs no introduction for many of you, but Mia Hughes is the Director of Genspect Canada, a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and a writer and researcher on all things gender scandal. So, Mia, welcome back. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to see you too.
I had the pleasure of finally meeting you in person at the Genspect conference in Albuquerque in 2025. And you gave this brilliant talk on a topic you've been working on a series of papers on, the idea of trans as an extreme overvalued belief. Let's dive into it. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so when I introduced this in Albuquerque, it was, for me, it was the end point of about 2.5 years of deep thinking into this one particular psychiatric concept. And then I throw it into my Albuquerque talk without really understanding that most people have never heard of the extreme overvalue belief, and that it was going to take far more explaining than I initially realized. So I'll start with the very basics of what this concept is. And it's a psychiatric concept that long neglected for some strange reason. It started out as the overvalued idea, and the term was coined in 1892 by a German psychiatrist, Carl Wernicke. And the overvalued idea received a lot of attention in British psychiatry, but almost none in American psychiatry. So I think that's the problem. And what it describes is one all-consuming idea that overtakes a person's entire life and drives them towards some kind of pathological behavior. They're either causing harm to themselves or they're causing harm to others, or both in some cases. And so I had been reading about trans for a long time, probably about 4 years, and you've got all these diagnoses all throughout the history of this disorder being recognized by psychiatry. You've got transsexualism, transvestic fetishism, you've got gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, all kinds of diagnoses that nobody ever really knew what they were treating. And there's no clarity to these diagnoses at all. Nobody's really getting to the cause of it. And I was trying to make sense of the diagnosis when I came across Dr. Paul McHugh calling transgender identification, an overvalued idea, just in passing in this paper about multiple personality disorder, actually. So Paul McHugh is obviously the man who shut down John Money. He was psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins, very respected psychiatrist and an excellent scholar. And he just throws into this paper that trans is an overvalued idea. And that's how I ended up there, because I'm like, oh, what's that? That sounds interesting. And I went into the papers. And so the overvalued idea It's just a psychiatric classification in that it separates trans from delusion and it separates trans from obsession. And that's, I think, the crucial differentiation that we're working with here, because many people think that a trans identified person, a man who thinks he's a woman, is delusional. But in the actual psychiatric classification, a delusion is idiosyncratic, it's individually held. Only you believe that aliens are communicating with you through the radio. No one else around you shares that belief or affirms that belief. So you can see that trans doesn't fit into that classification at all, because everybody is affirming this man as a woman and we're all pretending that there's such a thing as a male woman. And then obsession, I know that you and I are going to have a lot to talk about here, because it can't be considered an obsession, because an obsession is something that is ego dystonic, which means it's experienced as distressing, and the thoughts or the beliefs are experienced as kind of repugnant and unacceptable and in conflict with who this person thinks they really are. And so they fight against those beliefs, and they act upon them with, obsessive compulsive disorder. The person will do their rituals or whatever, but they're fighting against it and they're finding it distressing. So again, everybody, I'm sure, can tell that trans doesn't fit in there. And the crucial part about the overvalued idea is that the individual relishes it, experiences it as a true, authentic expression of their most deepest nature. They relish it, they cherish it, they embrace it completely. And so obviously that makes sense with trans. That is the way these people are experiencing their trans identities. They're not finding them distressing, and they're not fighting against them. They're very much relishing them and acting upon them. And so I'm talking about overvalued ideas, but I should explain why in my talk I used the term extreme overvalued belief. And that's because, so it was an overvalued idea for decades, probably for about a century, until 9/11 comes along, and Paul McHugh actually takes the concept of the overvalued idea and applied it to the terrorists. And think about it, it does make perfect sense. He's like, these terrorists were very much, their minds were dominated by a very rigid belief, and they acted upon it. And it was a true expression of their authentic self, and they absorbed it from the culture in which they lived. And so McHugh was the one who took the overvalued idea and applied it to a cultural belief, a belief that is reinforced by a culture or subculture that comes to dominate a person's mind and propels them in that sense towards atrocious acts of mass murder or acts of violence. And so that was the turning point for the overvalued idea concept. From that point on, it became of interest to forensic psychiatry, and then a forensic psychiatrist, Tahir Rahman, used it to analyze, what's his name, Anders Breivik, the man who the mass murder in Norway, terrible act of mass violence in Norway. This man who had been very, very active in white supremacist, neo-Nazi internet echo chambers, came to believe that he needed to save Norway from immigration, from being invaded, and so he committed a terrible act of mass murder in the service of that belief. So then we get Tahir Rahman. He coins the term extreme overvalued belief, and he's written a book called The Extreme Overvalued Belief, and it details acts of mass violence, lone wolf acts of mass violence that are propelled by political beliefs. But when you read his book, and this was the aha moment for me, this was when I felt like I'd cracked the code. I read his book and I'm like, goodness me, this is like reading about trans. Not that I'm saying trans identified people are in any way violent, but if you read the way he defines an extreme overvalued belief, it is a rigidly held, non delusional conviction that is shared by others in your culture or subculture, that is amplified until it consumes the individual. And then the individual, it comes to dominate their life. They relish it, they cherish it, they act upon it, and then they take it to an extreme where they are acting pathologically. Now, to me, I framed it in my Albuquerque talk. The trans-identified person is not going out and shooting people or being violent towards others. They are seeking extreme self-harm. They are seeking from surgeons and from doctors medical interventions that do terrible harm to themselves. But because they are in the service of this belief that they cherish and they experience as a complete and true expression of their deepest, most internal nature, they don't realize that they're pursuing something pathological. They think they're pursuing life-altering, life-saving, ethical medical care.
Well, that's a brilliant explanation you've laid out there for us, front and center, the history of the terminology, the way it connects to other things. And it makes me think of how the human mind is such a fascinating thing. Um, I put a lot of emphasis on neuroplasticity in my parent coaching work and in my course because it's fascinating, because so much of the problems and the solutions here hinge on it, and because late adolescence, early adulthood is a time of tremendous neuroplasticity. And so when I hear you describe what you call the extreme overvalued belief and how it maps onto trans, I think about the meaning making system that a lot of these young people have. This idea enters the picture that has a lot of allure, it has an emotional pull, it feels like it solves a problem. And one thing parents frequently get wrong about this is they tend to assume, in my experience at least, talking to parents of trans-identified youth, they tend to assume that the kid has more insight, more psychological insight than they really do about, oh, why do you feel this way, or things like that. And I explain to people at least once a week that they don't have psychological insight, and you don't have to have psychological insight in order for something to have a powerful emotional pull on you, in order for an idea to be very appealing because of the emotional impact it has on you. And all of this can be going on well beneath the surface of conscious awareness. So, a person's plagued by a problem, a potential solution appears. They may not have psychological insight into the emotional pull that it has on them. But then now there's an incentive to map everything that happens to them to this. And it can snowball because of that neuroplasticity, because of our ability to form associations. Every feeling connects to trans, just like when I was counseling someone with a food addiction. If I'm happy, I celebrate by eating. If I'm sad, I comfort myself by eating. If I'm angry, I suppress my anger by eating. Everything connects to food if that is a person's drug of choice. Similarly with trans, I had a bad day for any reason. I had a distressing emotion. I had a glimmer of hope. In whatever happens, I connect it to this particular meaning making system. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It does. I mean, I agree that these kids, well, I would argue that no one in the grips of this belief understands that they're in the grips of a belief, and that is by definition what these beliefs are. The individual doesn't recognize them as being a psychiatric disorder, but particularly the kids, because they're just kids. They don't, the adolescents don't understand anything. They think they understand everything. They don't actually understand anything, really. And so that's the particular danger. That's why before we hit record, I was saying I really feel as though I've cracked the code, because everything can be explained using this framework. And what the real danger to these kids, they don't have the cognitive maturity, they don't have the life experience, and they're in that period of identity fluctuation, diffusion. They're not really sure who they are yet. And then the trans overvalued belief, the extreme overvalued belief, is thrust upon them because the entire movement, the entire transactivism movement, is the extreme overvalued belief. It has been forced from a tiny subculture, a fringe group of strange doctors and a few individuals. It's been that this overvalued belief has been thrust into the mainstream, and not just thrust into the mainstream, but then forced onto young people who are still in this fluctuating stage of identity development. And it does look as if it's the solution. And you're right. Once they adopt it, because they're looking for an explanation for why they feel so bad, and once they adopt the belief, once it lands in their mind and it just lodges and stays there, then they can interpret everything through the lens of that belief, which is typical of all of these overvalued beliefs. They dominate the mind. So if you've got one belief lodged in your mind and it is now central to your very core identity, of course you're going to interpret every experience through the lens of that belief, because it is the most central part of who you are right now. But the very, very dangerous thing about this one, not only is it obviously forced upon young people via education, media, social media, every single angle basically, and the belief is elevated to this sacred identity that, one, you cannot question, and two, you actually must celebrate. Don't question it and absolutely celebrate it. But at the same time, lying in wait is an entire field of medicine completely guided by this belief. You see, the entire field of so-called gender-affirming care is built upon the trans overvalue belief, which I think actually I've got ahead of myself here, because I don't think I've defined the trans overvalued belief yet, have I? Which I should do. I will say there's a lot of things, a lot of projects that I'm working on, one of which is a research project into what beliefs these people hold that drives them towards medical transition. But condensing it into its simplest form, the trans overvalued belief is, I am trans, my trans identity is healthy, and I need medical body modification in order to live an authentic, happy life. That is what I've condensed it into its simplest form. Now, I've already interviewed a whole bunch of people as a kind of like a pilot, a test project for my actual research, and I got plenty of other answers. The other variants of this, because it's difficult, the I am trans, because then these people are like, okay, but everyone has a different understanding, or there are many different understandings of what I am trans means. And so for some people, it was, they believed not so much that they were actually born in the wrong body, but that they would be happier living as a member of the opposite sex. They were not adequately masculine, so they would be happier living as a woman. They were not adequately feminine, so they would therefore be happier living as a man. And what unites all of these different beliefs is that they ultimately drive the person towards seeking hormonal and surgical body modification as the road to happiness. So that's the trans overvalue belief. But think about it. The crucial part to me is an overvalued belief is experienced as healthy. And so that's what we are right now doing in this mad era of transactivism. WPATH, transactivism, has de-psychopathologized trans identities, which means they are presenting trans identities as healthy. That's the core of the overvalued belief. And then going hand in hand with this trans identities are healthy is medical body modification is a human right. Okay, that's the overvalued belief. That is, these people are singularly focused on obtaining the hormones and surgeries that they believe are the only road to authenticity and happiness. And it's just been transformed into a civil rights movement and then pushed onto young people who are still in a stage of identity development, and they are just having it lodged in, it just lodges in the minds of some. And then the entire field of gender affirming care likewise is built upon this extreme overvalue belief that one, trans identities are healthy, so you cannot try and help the person overcome their desire, their trans identification, because that's conversion therapy. And two, you must provide the medical interventions that the belief demands, because that's a human right. And if you don't provide those interventions, then you are violating the human rights of your patient.
Out of all the brilliant things you just shared, one piece I can pick up on next is how this creates a problematic incentive structure. When there is that extreme overvalued belief and that is deemed healthy and de-psychopathologized, then we have actual health and this definition of health pulling in two completely opposite directions. So as long as we're operating from a belief system that the mind and body are one, and that something that's harmful to the body is going to be harmful to the mind and vice versa, then we have a coherent value system that allows us to make decisions that make sense. But you use the word health, right? That the idea with the overvalued belief is that the trans identity is healthy. And well, we know that the implications of that identity literally shorten lifespans, increase the risk of all-cause mortality, right? So the definition of health there becomes split and polarized so that it's pulling in two different directions. I think we could even go further than to say that it's thought of as healthy. It's thought of as the only thing, right? It's thought of as so synonymous with the identity of the individual that to question it is to question their right to exist. That's where we get a lot of the hyperbolic, histrionic language. And I think it has to be structured that way in order to survive, because if we treat it as anything less than that, then we do have to question the health outcomes of these decisions, right? If we treat this as a choice, then we have to question if it's the healthiest choice. But if it's framed in as a life or death matter, well, then it's better to be alive and to exist, even if your lifespan is 10 years shorter and you have Alzheimer's at 50, than it is to not get to be yourself.
Yeah, it's a totally different world. And that's the most important part, I think, to understanding all of this, because it can seem so completely insane and so completely mad what they're doing unless you're able to understand the world that they live in. And so, yes, for them, and this is, I was just reading, actually, I'm reading The Dutch Approach, Alex Bakker. This individual transitioned in the Dutch, the early days of the Dutch protocol, and has written the history of the Dutch starting this whole mad experiment. And there's a wonderful quote in there, because the medical ethics side of this has its origins in a Christian hospital, and the individual who was tasked with presenting to the ethics board, I'm talking in the 70s here, says something like, you know, in the Christian world, in Christian thinking, the soul or the psyche is more important than the body. And therefore, if the person's soul or psyche is causing them so much distress and you can't fix it, then you should operate on a healthy body. You should cut into a healthy body, because that's what they're debating at the time. Should we cut into healthy bodies? And so you can see they're prioritizing psychological well-being, and they had basically given up at that point. They're like, there's nothing we can do for these people. Their psychological suffering is so terrible that the only ethical justification is to cut into these healthy bodies. That's the way that they were framing harm. Harm in that world is not cutting into the healthy bodies. Harm in our world, or certainly the world that I live in, is cutting into healthy bodies. And it all stems from the fact that they just gave up. There's nothing we can do for these people. We can't help them psychologically, so we have to help them medically. I would argue that that is because, one, in the 1970s, they didn't understand autogynephilia. So I think everybody had an idea that erotic motivations were behind the trans identities of many of these men, not all of them, but many of them, but they didn't understand autogynephilia at the time. And on top of that, they weren't seeing this as an overvalued idea because this was just not even something they were considering. So they weren't approaching it in the right way. I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced that you can you can psychotherapeutically guide someone out of autogynephilia. However, I think, do all of your viewers know what autogynephilia is? Should I explain it?
I mean, some people might be listening for the first time.
Right. So autogynephilia is a paraphilia in which a man is aroused by the fantasy of becoming a woman, like having breasts, a vagina, being treated as a woman. There's the transvestic side as well, dressing as a woman, but it's largely about medically embodying a female body, like becoming a woman and having female body parts and bodily functions. And so that drives most men, or did certainly in the 1970s when they were having these ethical discussions, but it wasn't the typology wasn't outlined until 1989, so we really didn't understand what was going on. These men, arguably, you can't talk them out of this erotic urge, it's probably quite difficult to do so, but I would argue that at the very least, trying to help them manage their erotic desires rather than just simply giving them the medical interventions that the erotic desire demands, trying to help them manage it is a more ethical, less harmful way to deal with it. But it all comes down to how you define harm. And again, there is this angle of, all along, gender medicine, as you know, has been built on give me what I want or I'll kill myself. I don't know if I can say that, if you bleep it out, if I can't. But this threat of, at the very least, if you don't give me what I want, I will harm myself, is the basis of gender affirming care, so called. It is the idea that if we do not do this for these individuals, they will cause themselves harm. So therefore, cutting into the healthy body is the least harmful approach, and therefore it is their human right. But I argue that that's not a healthy way to approach any field of medicine, and that everybody needs to just calm down, take a step back, and I think rethink the entire way that we approach care for all of the individuals who seek this medical treatment.
Mia, you described an attitude of sort of helpless, frantic incompetence on the part of an unspecified group of individuals. And I'm really curious who that group is. The ones who said, well, these patients are suffering so badly and there's no other way to help them. The ones who gave up, essentially, and says, just give the patients what they want. Who are these people? Because I have some thoughts about them.
Who are the individuals who gave up?
Yeah.
When I was talking about the Dutch in the 1970s. So this was the turning point, as far as I can see, in that 1950s, 1960s. That was mostly going on in the US. John Money, Robert Stoller, Harry Benjamin, all the rest of them, and they definitely viewed cutting into healthy bodies as harm. Nobody was really very comfortable sending these men along to have their penises chopped off. It was viewed, surgeons had problems with it ethically. It was a bit, horrifying for most people. And then it was the Dutch. It was the Dutch in the 1970s. They started this experiment. They they can't find any surgeons. Medical ethics boards are like rejecting it. No, you can't cut into healthy bodies. They were going simply on that. That was the phrase. It's harm. You are not allowed to cut into a healthy body. That's a violation of medical ethics, which I think most people still to this day would agree with. But then in this ethical debate that they were having, someone came along. Was it? Oh, I can't remember his name. It's gone completely out of my mind. Someone came along and presented to the ethics board this idea that the soul, the psyche, is more important in a Christian sense. And if the soul and the psyche are so tortured because of a mismatch with the body, then the ethical thing to do is cut into the body. And I think that is just them giving up. They weren't helping these largely paraphilic men get over their sexual desires. So they just gave up and said, okay, we'll just start cutting into the healthy bodies. And of course, that's the Dutch. It starts there with adults, and they do this to adults, but then it's just a short stepping stone, isn't it, to doing it to children. So that really is the origins of the entire medical scandal as we know it in the pediatric sense.
When I'm thinking about this Dutch group, I'm wondering what were the professional backgrounds of the people who were coming together to have these dialogues? Because I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of a therapist, for example. How many of the people arguing for this, well, there's nothing else we can do to help these people. They're so distressed. Just, do what they say they want from us. I mean, it sounds interdisciplinary, right? It sounds like some of the people involved in this conversation were on the clinical psychotherapeutic side of things. Some of them were on the medical. The whole scandal is rests upon the intersection of those two fields, and the intersection being handled quite sloppily. But I'm just thinking from a psychotherapeutic standpoint, what this points to about the importance of personal insight and training on transference and countertransference dynamics, because as therapists, we are triggered to feel a lot of different things toward our patients. Sometimes we feel helpless, incompetent, impotent, even powerless, frustrated, and a good psychodynamic training teaches the therapist to reflect on that as clinical information, learn from it, be able to discern what is sort of my stuff, right? What is, oh, I'm feeling this way because this is part of my psychological makeup. What is something that the patient is sparking in me because the patient tends to spark this feeling in people? How can I learn from this? How can I process this, right? And so our most frustrating cases can really teach us a lot. But what I hear happening in that space when I imagine mental health professionals having a voice in that conversation of saying, we can't do anything else to help, just give them what they want, is that feels like unchecked countertransference to me. That feels like a therapist not having good emotional boundaries, not being able to differentiate and self-reflect on the experience of frustration, bewilderment, helplessness, and fear that the patient is sparking in them. And that feels like an ethical failure.
I'm just looking because, well, the book's right there. If you don't mind, I can go get it. I think he was a plastic surgeon. I think it was a surgeon presenting to his ethics board. You see, the reason why I like the Dutch approach, it's a difficult book to get your hands on. A lovely lady gave it to me when I was in Belgium, actually. The reason I like it is because it's the stories of the doctors and the psychologists and the endocrinologists and the surgeons. It's the human element. And that is what we all kind of lose when we're talking about this, because we focus on the what I believe is a medical crime. We focus on what they're doing and the scandal without understanding the human beings that all kind of crossed paths at just the right time with just the right ideas, with just to make this medical scandal possible. And if I'm not mistaken, the guy who was presenting to the ethics board was a plastic surgeon. But then you have, it's the Netherlands, 1970s, so you've got the political momentum, the moral enthusiasm of the time. They're all swept up in this, and it's an extremely progressive nation. So I guess I can't really apply any motives to this person, but there is the possibility as well that he was swept up in the enthusiasm for the experiment, the challenge, the possibility of being on the cutting edge of this new exciting field of medicine. So the motivations of each of the human beings in this medical scandal, and there have been so many, are all fascinating to me. It's totally fascinating to me. But if I do think it was a plastic surgeon, a surgeon presenting to his board. There were psychologists involved, very few. And that's the other thing that you've got to understand is this is a very, very, very fringe field of medicine. Almost no one will touch it. They can't find anyone to care for these individuals. And the idea is out there because at the same time they're doing media, they're talking to the press, they're going on television shows to promote the idea that some people are transgender and that they need these medical treatments. They're doing that to help their patients. But every time they do that, there's even a quote in there, the guy who manages the whole sentence, he says, the whole clinic, he says, every time a trans-identified person appeared on television, the phone was ringing off the hook for the next few days because people had saw it and they're like, oh, that explains what I'm feeling. I need this medical treatment too. So they're doing the media promotion to increase acceptance of trans-identified people, but they're also contributing to the social contagion. But at the same time, nobody in the medical world will go near this because they all find it repulsive and absolutely abhorrent. And so then they're trying to, within their hospital, increase acceptance of these procedures that they themselves really believe in. And so that's why they're coming up with these, in my mind, that's why they're coming up with these ideas. Oh, the soul, the psyche, it's more important. And I do think that they're all swept up by the belief, by the idea, and quite possibly by the idea that this can make them famous in some way.
Yeah, it's fascinating to speculate about the motivations of the different people involved because with the surgeons, like you say, there's the excitement of, you know, being the first to do something, feeling like a pioneer, feeling the thrill, the challenge of the procedure of getting better at something that they've been practicing their whole life. And this might be someone, very low in empathy, right? We know, like, statistically, surgeons are more likely to be sociopathic in terms of just their brain structure. Um, and then I can speculate, of course, about the psychotherapist, whether it's the lack of insight into the transference, countertransference dynamics, whether it's also that excitement of, oh, do I have that rare special patient, right? The sort of excitement of, oh, this novelty, this rare condition. Am I going to be one of the ones who's on the cutting edge of my field? And in the same way that it has that glimmer, I think, for certain parents who've drunk the Kool-Aid, right? Not listeners of this podcast, but on the other side of that issue. Oh, do I have the special trans child, the magical trans child?
And isn't there also, I think there might be, in many cases, and you've kind of sense it with the Dutch at the beginning, it's, I'm a good person. Look at how much better I am because I can accept these people for who they are. Like I'm so much more enlightened than these Philistines over here. I'm a good person because I can accept this. And we just need to bring everyone just needs to catch up to me and my colleagues. And that's still going on in WPATH now to this day. They're still on this righteous quest. They still see themselves as being the good progressive people, and it's just the transphobic bigots that they have to convince, and then they'll catch up and then everybody will support them. It doesn't I can understand with the Dutch way back when, I suppose, because it was all new and the harm was there though. And that's the thing that is distressing to read is it's very, very clear that many of the patients that they saw were not helped, were not doing well, and yet still they carried on. But if you're still in 2026 convinced that you are a good person and the rest of the world just needs to get over their bigotry and accept trans-identified people for who they are, of course you're in the service, you're acting in the service, you're an ideologue, you're acting in the service of a belief and reality. You're not in touch with reality. You've gone into an extreme area.
And I think it's even darker because on some level they know they'll never get everyone over to their side. And so as long as there's another side combined with that self-righteous mentality, then there's, well, we're better than them, right? And the more extreme evidence we have of how these things are obviously not good for physical health, the more distorted the mental ideas have to become to continue justifying the destruction of the body.
Well, I think it just ricochets off them. I think I like to think of the belief as a kind of protective sphere around these people. And so if there's any evidence of harm, it really doesn't even enter their mind. It just ricochets off. And we've seen this in true believers throughout history and every mass movement that has occurred. It's not unique to trans. It's just we're we're it's our job. That's what we do all the time, is highlight the harm and show the harm. So it's a fascinating thing to witness. I think I think of the individual with this protective sphere around them. The belief protects them, but think of the entire WPATH. WPATH exists inside a fortress, and really, truly, nothing penetrates. No systematic review is ever going to sway WPATH. The CAST report is not going to do anything. Forget any high quality evidence out of Finland. Forget it. It doesn't mean anything to these people. It doesn't even make it inside. And if by any chance, the CAST report did manage to penetrate, it got in, and then they produced this insane statement because they read the CAST report just entirely through the lens of their belief, and it's just transphobia. It's just the work of right-wing bigots who infiltrated the NHS or something like that. So forget trying to win this, defeat them with evidence. You can't defeat ideologues with evidence because the evidence means nothing to them.
Let's take a quick break. And when we return, we'll talk about your campaign to re-psychopathologize the trans identity. Your trans-identified kid won't listen to reason because reason isn't what they need right now. They need a parent who knows how to communicate in an empathic yet strategic manner. ROGD Repair gives you over 120 lessons in the psychology and communication tools that actually work when normal parenting doesn't. Plus, RepairBot, your 24/7 AI coach trained on my entire body of work, ready to help you navigate tough moments in real time. Visit rogdrepair.com and use code SOMETHERAPIST2026 to take half off your first month. So let's talk about your campaign as part of Genspect to re-psychopathologize the trans identity. But I think in order to do so, we need to talk about how it's been de-psychopathologized by groups like WPATH and other trans advocacy groups. And that really makes no sense when you consider all the similarities that the trans identity has to things like anorexia, obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder. And I know you mentioned when you were describing trans as an extreme overvalued belief, but even extreme acts of violence can be connected to this concept. So let's talk about the psychopathology part.
Yeah, it's a really important part. It's, to me, after years and years of studying this social contagion medical scandal, I came to the conclusion that the core of it is de-psychopathologization. And that is, I took that word, I didn't make that up. I took that word from WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which of course I've been writing about for years. And many times in my writing, I had cited the pivotal moment in 2010 when WPATH released its de-psychopathologization statement. And that is, they just pull this idea out of thin air, but they declare that trans identities are a healthy variation of human existence. They actually say, I think they word it gender diversity. And that's the sneaky thing about these people. They never say what they really mean, because, of course, gender diversity is a healthy variation of human existence. So most people are like, oh, yeah, okay, that's fine. Some people are more masculine, some more feminine. There's a whole range of gender expressions out there. But that's not actually what WPATH meant with their 2010 de-psychopathologization statement. What they meant was identifying as a member of the opposite sex and seeking and obtaining hormonal and surgical body modification is a healthy variation of human existence. That's what they really meant. What that is truly, you can trace it to the extreme overvalue belief. It is, they are, I'm going to go back to the late 1990s. And this is when WPATH was called HBIGDA, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. And HBIGDA, in its early days, was a group of definitely fringe doctors who were trying to help individuals who wanted this medical treatment, who believed themselves to be members of the opposite sex and believed that they needed this medical treatment. But then in the 1990s, trans activism is really starting to gain strength, and trans-identified activists began to join HBIGDA. And we know that this is true. You can see it in the way HBIGDA changes its approach to formulating standards of care, its messaging, but we also know it because Dr. Stephen Levine was one of the original members of HBIGDA, or early days members of HBIGDA, and he saw it with his own eyes. So he said early 2000s, he was at one of their annual conferences, and the way he words it, and I love it, he says there were a lot of cross-dressed men in the audience. And when people were on the stage speaking about how to diagnose, how to treat, presenting scientific presentations, these cross-dressed men in the audience would heckle them because they were saying things that the men did not believe aligned with the true nature that they felt that they were women. And so allowing these trans-identified activists into HBIGDA is what transformed the organization from something like pursuing science to an organization that is predominantly guided by activism. But you've got to understand who those men were. They were men who were their lives, their minds were totally dominated by the belief, the extreme overvalue belief that one, trans is natural and healthy. So yes, they are women. They are women. They don't have a psychiatric disorder. That's the crucial part of this belief, is you believe that you are a member of the opposite sex. And these individuals get really upset at the mere suggestion that their identity could be related to a psychiatric disorder. They get really upset at the suggestion that their identity is in any way pathological. And they also get really upset by anyone who tries to prevent them from obtaining the hormones and surgeries that their overvalue belief demands. They have tunnel vision, they are fixated, and they are on this track where nothing can get in their way. And so this is who populated HBIGDA, and then it turned into WPATH. As soon as WPATH rebranded, it was guided entirely by this belief that trans is natural and healthy and medical body modification is a human right. And because that was the guiding principle inside the organization, they then launch de-psychopathologization, which is it's just taking the belief and turning it into an entire campaign, an entire political campaign. So they announce in 2010 that trans is natural and healthy, and then they make it their business to ensure that this de-psychopathologization campaign is embedded into the entire field of gender medicine. First of all, they succeed in getting it into the American Psychiatric Association because at the time the diagnosis was gender identity disorder. So the identity is the disorder. They can't have that because the identity is healthy. So they de-psychopathologize, they turn it into gender dysphoria. With the diagnosis of gender dysphoria in DSM 5, the identity is healthy and it's the distress that you feel because you have this healthy identity that doesn't match your body. The distress is the disorder. But then think about what that means. That means the only possible way to treat the disorder is to medicalize the body, to bring the body in line with this healthy identity that you just so happen to have. That's de-psychopathologization. Then from there, of course, they go to the World Health Organization next. That was the diagnosis was gender identity disorder as well. They transformed that in 2018 in the World Health Organization's International Classification of Disease version 11. They turn it into gender incongruence, which is also de-psychopathologization. It's just your body and mind don't match, and therefore you should have medical intervention. That's the diagnosis. And so it all the crucial part of de-psychopathologization that I think most people miss is because they framed the trans identity as healthy when clearly it's the result of a psychiatric disorder. It's a psychiatric condition, but they reframed this mental illness as a perfectly healthy identity, which is dangerous in and of itself because anyone who is suffering from a mental illness is not well served by everyone pretending that they're perfectly healthy. But the other crucial part is when they reframed it as healthy, they made it not only possible to celebrate it, but because trans activism is so aggressive in its approach, they made it mandatory that we celebrate it. So we had, Laverne Cox, Caitlyn Jenner, I Am Jazz. Those were just a tiny few. We all of a sudden trans identified celebrities, so individuals who have this psychiatric disorder and have medicalized their bodies as a result of this psychiatric disorder, were then thrust into the mainstream. They're on the cover of magazines, they're celebrated, they're elevated to almost a sacred status, and everybody is just, forced to go along with this. That could only happen because they de-psychopathologized. It's impossible. If we were still grounded in reality, if we still recognized that this was an actual psychiatric disorder and it requires ethical psychotherapeutic care, then nobody would be putting these individuals on the cover of magazines. But because WPATH shifted that, they forced everyone to celebrate it, and I believe that's what triggered the social contagion. Because the moment we're celebrating it and we're teaching kids in schools that some people are trans, and I Am Jazz is telling kids that, you can be born with the boy brain, a girl brain and a boy body and all the rest of it, then the idea lands into the minds of young people. And these young people are not identifying, think about it, they're not identifying as having a psychiatric disorder. They're not identifying as having gender dysphoria. They're not identifying as having autogynephilia. They're identifying as trans, and trans is the healthy identity. So the harm that de-psychopathologization unleashed is almost immeasurable in my mind. All of it stems from de-psychopathologization. And bear in mind that all of those social contagion kids who are exposed to this messaging then fall into a medical world entirely guided by WPATH, guided by de-psychopathologization, which means they're not being seen as having a psychiatric disorder. They show up at the gender clinic, they say, I am trans, and everybody in the gender clinic says, yes, you are, and that's great, and they affirm it, and then they provide the medical interventions that the trans identity demands. So when I gave my talk in Albuquerque, I outlined de-psychopathologization, I explained the harm of it, and then I announced that Genspect was officially launching its Re-Psychopathologization Campaign. Of course, it's just a play on WPATH's wording. And very deliberately so. I understand that perhaps it was a bold thing to say, and believe me, the response was it was quite it was not well received, let's just say that. But of course, the reason I chose the word re-psychopathologization is deliberately to show that we are turning back all of the harm that WPATH's de-psychopathologization campaign has done, and I stand by it. However, trans activists lost their minds, of course. That was in no way a surprise. Perhaps the lengths that they went to, or the extreme things that they said, even that wasn't really that surprising. But there were lots of calls for extreme acts of violence against Genspect members and such. That is, when they respond in that way, I will say that that is actually exactly how you would expect individuals who are consumed by an extreme overvalued belief. That's exactly how you would expect them to react, because, like I said, one of the defining features of anybody whose mind is dominated by an extreme overvalued belief is they really, really respond viciously to anyone who suggests that their identity is pathological instead of, innate and healthy. And they also they react very aggressively towards anyone who they perceive to be trying to step in the way of them obtaining whatever goal their belief demands. In this case, it is the medical interventions. But I will say that people on so-called our side also responded. Some people responded quite negatively to my talk, and that was because of my use of the word re-psychopathologization. However, I still stand by it, and that's because to psychopathologize something in one community, it's a dirty word, I suppose, and it comes out of the anti-psychiatry movement of the 60s and 70s, where they viewed all diagnosis as being oppression. It's discrimination or it's oppression. Even schizophrenia or really, really severe mental health issues, they viewed all of it as being a tool of oppression, and therefore get rid of all diagnoses. I don't belong to that world, and I didn't realize anyone on so-called our side did belong to that world, but apparently they do. I was using to psychopathologize in its neutral clinical sense, and that means recognizing something as a mental disorder in order to understand it and ethically treat it and help the person understand themselves and overcome, to the best of the therapist's ability, help them overcome whatever is troubling them. I didn't realize that it was going to cause so much controversy on my people I would consider on my own side. So that was the reason why I chose the word re-psychopathologization. And since then, we have yet to be published, but we've been working on a series of papers explaining what we mean by trans as an extreme overvalued belief and explaining why re-psychopathologization is necessary.
I want to talk for a moment about the DSM-5 and the term gender dysphoria, because you talked about the shift where in previous DSMs, it was gender identity disorder, right? And DSM-5, that came out 2013, which is the same year that I graduated from my graduate program in counseling psychology. And as you said, now the push in the ICD-11 is gender incongruence. So for people who are like, what's the DSM versus the ICD? So the DSM is specifically the psychiatric listing. I hate it when people call the Bible. It's more like the dictionary or the encyclopedia of the current understanding of psychiatric diagnoses, which is obviously heavily politicized, very influenced by culture, by the pharmaceutical industry. It's a work in progress, right? I would like to do an interview soon with my friend Soad Tabrizi because I know that she's been keeping track of the latest developments toward the DSM-6, right? So the DSM, for listeners, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The ICD is the International Classification of Diseases, so it's much broader. It's what doctors use. And so all of the DSM diagnoses and codes are within the ICD, but it's a different, much broader classification system. So the ICD is on the 11 now, where gender incongruence is a term. The DSM is still on the 5, released in 2013, where it's gender dysphoria. And so the shift, as Mia is pointing out, towards the idea of gender incongruence is the most de-psychopathologized because it's just saying, oh, your mind and body don't match. And it's not, let's fix your mind, it's let's fix your body. But I did want to talk a little bit about the DSM-5 because it was released at an interesting time in the unfolding of all of this. And it's actually not clear in the DSM-5 what they expect therapists to do about this. Yes, it says preference for activities and styles of dress and things associated with the opposite sex. There's very little to no mention of the sexual component of that. Like you say, the distress is definitely a defining criteria, but that's also the case with anything in the DSM. It has to cause clinically significant distress or functional impairment or both in order to meet criteria. But if you go on to read the description of gender dysphoria, the narrative component in the DSM, it doesn't say therapists should or shouldn't do this or that. It's very neutral. And the rates, the prevalence statistics given are obviously old. Like the numbers are just intuitively, when you read them, those are like numbers from 20 years ago. And then it says, well, some people choose to medicalize this and become transgender, blah, blah, blah. But does it say, as a therapist, you should write a letter encouraging that? Does it say, as a therapist, you should explore, what this might have to do with childhood trauma or with paraphilias or with obsessive compulsive disorder? It doesn't say any of that. And I think that's really interesting. And the other thing I will put a little bit of a fine point on is the term dysphoria itself and how it's used now by the youth. Because, like Mia's saying, a lot of them, they don't say, I have dysphoria, they say I'm trans, but some of them do say, I have dysphoria. And again, going back to that idea of the extreme overvalued belief in their meaning-making system and how they're using their neuroplasticity in this chapter of life, anything that goes wrong, anything that doesn't feel good, that gets labeled my dysphoria. And that gets painted in contrast to the concept of euphoria, the gender euphoria that I anticipate I will have. And that to me feels like just a hacking of our motivation and reward system. Before we started recording, Mia, you had mentioned that when you talk about cracking the code in your research and your writing, you described feeling a sense of euphoria associated with cracking the code. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I know that feeling, that dopamine, that, oh, I'm on the right track. I'm discovering something. And it's like, that's actually what dopamine is meant to do for you. It's meant to reward meaningful effort. It's meant to reward progress toward goals, but it can also really easily be exploited. So if we think about all the pleasurable feelings that we get out of doing things like meaningful work or building something or becoming enlightened on a path of genuine intrigue, imagine that's the same feeling, that's the same motivational system that is being hacked in these kids, where anytime they get so-called properly gendered as opposed to misgendered, right? Then they feel that little euphoria, right? And it's the placebo effect because they had that extreme overvalued belief. They've convinced themselves that's what they need in order to be happy. But this is what I mean when I talk about neuroplasticity. I mean, if that is how you are using your brain, reinforcing it over and over, it does become true for you. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's why it's so hard to treat it at this point. So people like Mia and everything downstream of the work you're doing, we have our work cut out for us, helping these people untangle all the mental knots that have been tied here.
It's true. I mean, when I said euphoria, I wasn't joking. When I've been, because I wrote my whole thesis out into one giant document, and as I added things in and I thinking through all of these areas, every time something slotted in, it felt like a eureka moment where I could just go running through the streets in excitement. However, the euphoria that these kids are chasing, it's artificial, or it's in the future. They build up in their mind that this next medical treatment is going to bring the euphoria, and maybe it does for a short time because the mind is very powerful, and you have achieved a goal that you fixated on, and you really believe, yeah, you can create feelings of euphoria, but it's usually short-lived.
Are you a free-thinking therapist looking for like-minded community? The Association for Mental Health Professionals is a sanctuary for holistic, critical thinking counselors and therapists who want to stand firm in our values and reclaim our profession from ideologues. AMHP offers its members a blog and podcast, monthly webinars, and an annual conference each fall in Texas. Visit associationformentalhealthprofessionals.org to join a growing number of like-minded therapists who want our profession back. All right, now back to the show. So Mia, you were saying that in your paper on Re-Psychopathologization, you compare how we're handling gender dysphoria with how we're handling anorexia and body dysmorphic disorder.
I think it's the strongest comparison to help people, like framing trans as an extreme overvalue belief. I understand that this is a brand new framing and it's taking time for people to understand, but it can help. When I was reading the literature on, it was all overvalued ideas back then. That was the concept that people were using. Repeatedly, I came across anorexia. And so in the paper that I've written, that we've yet to find a journal to publish it, but we're just coming to the end of writing it. We drew the comparison between anorexia, and it really works well because anorexia is also a disorder of overvalued idea, in the sense that it's usually an adolescent girl or a young woman, and the idea that she holds, the belief that she holds, is typically something along the lines of she is one cannot be too thin. Thinner is better, and one cannot be too thin. And that fits into the culturally approved narrative, right? Because we do still live in a culture where thin is considered better, and fat, to be fat is considered shameful. There's no doubt about that. Look at, any popular culture, look at any television show, movies, whatever. Even with fat positivity movements, we still live in this world where we value people who are thin over people who are fat. And so the anorexic just takes that belief to the extreme. I mean, in the ICD, we were just talking about the ICD, the World Health Organization's classification. Anorexia is classified as a disorder of overvalued idea, and it is the fear of flabbiness. So an anorexic just absolutely detests any body fat of any kind, and it becomes this all-consuming belief. This belief dominates her mind. There's nothing else in her life. It's all about restricting food, making sure that she doesn't eat anything that could possibly add even a tiny little bit of body fat, compulsive behaviors, exercising and restricted eating, obsessing over food. But the crucial part of anorexia is that she experiences this belief as egosyntonic. So we're right back to that term, which is crucial for the overvalued idea or the overvalued belief. She experiences her desire to be emaciated and no body fat whatsoever as a true expression of who she is. She doesn't see herself as having a mental disorder. An anorexic is not going to show up at a psychiatrist's clinic asking for help to overcome her anorexia. She relishes it. She cherishes it. She thinks that she typically thinks that she is better than everyone else, and has this warped view that other people are looking at her and they're jealous and they wish that they could be as thin as she is. And so that's why the comparison works really well, because it's the anorexic's family who typically convince her to go and get psychiatric support. And she will fight against anyone who tries to make her gain weight, because she does not see herself as being ill at all. And so when I thought this through, I realized gender affirming care, so called, the entire field of gender medicine is the equivalent of the anorexic showing up at the eating disorder clinic and saying that she's too fat and she needs to lose weight, and the clinic saying, yes, you are too fat, here's your treatment, it's Ozempic, here's your Ozempic. And then the amazing thing about gender affirming care, the field of gender affirming care, is that the way they measure whether or not these medical interventions are the right thing to do is by self-report. We all know that. All of the studies in gender medicine are not long-term studies measuring life situation, objective outcome, how the person is functioning in life. It's self-report. They give these people the medical treatments that they want, and then at the end they say, are you happy? So that's the equivalent of your anorexic showing up at an eating disorder clinic, being given liposuction and Ozempic, and then at the end of it, all of the studies are asking her if she's happy. Now, of course she's happy. The disorder that she has propels her towards this behavior, this pathological, dangerous behavior to lose as much weight as possible. And if you give her the drugs and the treatments that help her achieve that goal, you are going to make her very happy. Her health will be destroyed. She will be emaciated and on the brink of death. But if you ask her if she's happy, she will absolutely say she is happy. That is exactly what is happening in gender medicine. They take the pathological desire, which is hormones and surgeries, that is the key symptom of the trans overvalued belief, is the desire for these drastic, irreversible medical interventions. And then they give the individual the very treatments that the key symptom demands. So the treatment and the symptom are exactly the same. They're one and the same. And then they measure their success by asking the individual whose mind is completely dominated by this idea, are you happy? And because we know 99% of them say, yes, I am happy, the entire field of gender medicine says, then we're doing the right thing. Everything is perfectly fine. The madness of it when you compare it to anorexia, which everyone can see is clearly a pathological disorder, but the point of re-psychopathologization, the point of framing trans as an extreme overvalued belief, and the point of comparing it with anorexia is to show that, as I said in my talk repeatedly, the madness lies in society. The madness, the individuals, they are possessed by an idea. They're in the grips of a belief and they need help. The true madness is how we as a society, and the medical world particularly, respond to the individuals who are now completely possessed by this idea. Because instead of trying to help them, we give them the exact pathological desire. We fulfill their pathological desire. So I suppose I'm pathologizing society. That's what the point of re-psychopathologization is we all have to recognize, we have to, one, stop celebrating this identity as healthy. We have to stop pretending that these medical interventions are ethical medical care and a human right. And we need to, it doesn't mean, like, I know I'm accused of all kinds of stuff. They accuse me of trying to exterminate trans-identified people. They accuse me of genocide and all of this. But actually, this group of people will still exist, but we will understand them better. The people treating them will understand what it is that they are treating. The people who have the idea will understand what it is that they have. And all of society will have a better understanding of what is going on with this group of people, and will stop mindlessly celebrating it without understanding it. I think I've just remembered what it was I forgot earlier. It was because you said the therapists have a really hard time with these individuals who show up very much in the grips of the belief. And that's a key part that is in the paper that I wrote, is when the person shows up seeking help, first of all, the trans-identified person, like the anorexic, the trans-identified person is not presenting to a healthcare professional or a mental health professional because they want to overcome their trans identity, because they don't realize that they have a pathological condition. They think that the trans identity is healthy, and they are showing up because they want the medical interventions. And the field of medicine is set up such that they can expect to obtain them. That's just where we are. Like, if you identify as trans, look, this is this entire field of medicine. The problem I think therapists, the front line, faces is, by the time the person presents to a clinic, they are already very much in the grips of the belief. So Carl Wernicke, who first outlined the overvalued idea, he makes very clear that the best hope that you have of loosening the grip of this idea is in its earliest stages, before it totally dominates the person's life. And he uses the phrase countervailing perspectives. You have to, it's the job of anyone around this person to introduce countervailing perspectives to show why the belief is either false or harmful or dangerous or whatever. But the problem that therapists, you guys, face is, by the time the person presents for care, the belief is fully and completely cemented into the mind. And once that happens, it's very difficult, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, to take the young person, or to take the whatever age person, get them off course and get the belief to loosen its grip. It's very much about just planting ideas, gently presenting different beliefs, different alternative perspectives, these countervailing perspectives that Wernicke talked about. And so by redefining trends in this way and introducing this whole framework, I want to be clear that I am in no way suggesting, oh, I've solved the problem, I've saved them all. I haven't in any way whatsoever. It's just a different way of viewing the trans-identified person, and it hopefully will give therapists and everybody in the medical world a different way of a way to understand these people and perhaps help them in a less destructive way.
I think there's a range of how dug in patients are when they arrive in the therapist's office. And in my line of work, I'm uniquely suited to hear all manner of stories, second and third hand stories about how one of my clients' kids' therapy is going. And of course, I'm perpetually disappointed in my colleagues, when I hear from a parent who really thought that they did their due diligence in screening to find a therapist who would be neutral, who seemed to have a more nuanced psychological understanding of these things. And then, time and again, I just keep hearing these therapists eventually cave in, or I hear that they do something naive. So a common mistake that I hear about is encouraging the parents to quote unquote compromise on pronouns or something like that. And to me, that shows me that the therapist has not had enough experience in this world that you and I are in to recognize that the ante will keep upping, that the goalposts will keep shifting, that this is not a satiable beast. This is not a situation that's amenable to compromise. As you pointed out very early in our conversation today, social transition leads to medical transition because, again, those neural pathways are being confirmed over and over again that this is who I am, this is how I must be seen and treated in order to be myself, in order to be okay, in order to be happy or move on with my life. And that becomes, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy. As I shared in, I think, what will be the previous episode to this one coming out, my personal read on the Finnish study, I talk about things like the untested hypothesis and the body as a hotel room, right? So, by those two things, I mean essentially that the young person is suspending self care, suspending anything that would help them settle into their body and grow confident as they are today because this belief system that they hold gets in the way of them doing so, right? If you were to get comfortable in your body the way it is now and accept being recognized as the sex you are, it would mean you're not really trans or you don't really have gender dysphoria, and that defines who you are, right? So again, the incentive structure here is just so whack. But my commentary on the therapist is, I do hear these stories where a parent thinks that they found a therapist who is going to serve their family well. And then the therapist ends up revealing themselves to be quite naive because they're trying to negotiate with the parent as if, if you just give in on pronouns, they'll come around, right? And it's like, that's not how this works if you've seen what these kids are like. And that's why I teach parents that my motto with therapists is guilty until proven innocent. You just have to be kind of paranoid towards them in today's climate. But I really do see a broad range. And I see therapists getting it wrong the other way around too, where sometimes a parent will tell me about a therapist that their kid was seeing before the gender issue ever came up. They were seeing them for some other reason, like divorce or something like that. And then the gender issue comes up. The parent is hesitant to take the kid away from a therapist they've been working with for years, who they have a good relationship with. And the therapist takes it too far. The kid's actually in a place of uncertainty, but the therapist jumps to, oh, well, then you must, go further with this. So that's a conversation for another time. My critique of all the things I hear of therapists. And you guys do have a hard job. You do have a hard job, my colleagues, but there's so many ways to get it wrong.
There is. I mean, I just hope that if everyone can understand what these pathological beliefs are, how they function, how they're egosyntonic, how the kid does not see or the young person does not see that they have a psychiatric disorder, and how countervailing perspectives can loosen the grip of the belief, but never in a direct confrontational way that will just cause the person to further entrench or likely just cut you out of their life. Then hopefully just understanding, first of all, I think it's just understanding what you're dealing with. And I think the extreme overvalued belief does bring clarity to this in a way that no other classification has so far. But I think as well, something that I haven't brought up is, because I was just talking about countervailing perspectives that jumped into my mind, is when Wernicke described this overvalued idea in the late 19th century, obviously he could never have imagined the world in which we live. So like there's the extreme acts of violence where they're in these internet echo chambers and the beliefs are being fortified and amplified, and then it just kind of lodges into one mind, and then this person acts. But there's something exceptional about trends in that for most of for the 2010s, I would argue, wider society functioned like an internet echo chamber because transactivism forbid anyone from deviating from this extreme overvalued belief that trans is healthy and medical interventions are a human right. Because of the climate of fear and because transactivism created a society-wide echo chamber. Many of these young people who got sucked into the vortex of this belief, there were no countervailing perspectives anywhere. But I do feel enormous hope now. We're in 2026 and the countervailing perspectives are there. Like, I've talked to detransitioners who say, well, one, there's a social contagion of detransition in just that they are encountering a detransitioner and they realize that this person is exactly like them. It's the same social mechanism that tragically drew them all in the first place when they encountered a lost, confused teenager online saying, I'm trans. Now they're encountering detransitioners who are the same as them again and drawing them out of the social contagion, out of the medical scandal. But I also think that because people are now not afraid of trans activists in the same way. Of course, the debate is on, the countervailing perspectives are out there, and detransitioners have said they listened to TERFs. That's what caused them to detransition. They encountered TERF narratives, they encountered the gender critical side, and at first they thought it was transphobic and terrible, but it lodged in their mind, and then eventually the belief started to loosen its grip and they realized what they had been a part of. So I think I feel hopeful that countervailing perspectives that was forbidden for so long, which is just reality, reality is now permitted. We can all talk about this, and that is going to, on the one hand, help draw people out from further medical harm, and on the other hand, prevent innocent people from falling into it in the first place.
And for the parents in the audience, just notice that Mia didn't say that they listened to their parents who were raging TERFs, and that they said, "Oh, you're right, mom and dad." Detransitioners who listened to TERFs came to appreciate those outside perspectives in their own time, in their own way. Um, you have to be very mindful of the developmental stage that they're in and the function that the trans identity serves in their process of developing autonomy. And one of the things I regularly work through with my clients is letting go of the naive fantasy that your kid's going to say, dad was right, mom was right. That's not how this is going to go, right? You are not the best messenger of these countervailing beliefs. And as Mia pointed out earlier, the best stage for intervention is early, before the beliefs have completely set and integrated with and taken over every aspect of that person's life. And again, that wedge needs to be sort of gentle and from the side rather than directly attacking something that that person perceives as fundamental to their identity and their value as a person. So if you're a parent, just know that what we talk about on this podcast, I say this almost every single episode, what we talk about on this podcast is for our information, for our understanding of the situation. It's not necessarily always that our approach to communicating about these issues on this podcast is the way that you should talk to your kids about that. If you have a child in this, you've probably already heard me advertise my program for parents, but RGD Repair is where you will learn specifically what communication techniques you can use as a parent that respond to your child's psychology and that take your family system into account. So I just wanted to add that note. If you're a long-term listener, you've heard me say that in all my recent episodes, just because the things we talk about here are not going to be well received if you take that exact same message and try to have that conversation with your kid, or heaven forbid, try to play an episode of my podcast for your child and you're bought into this. It's not going to go the way you hope. That's why we have a whole separate curriculum for learning how to talk about this in your family.
I'd be interested to know what you think about this, because this is something it's in my mind. I read Hadley Freeman's Good Girls. So Hadley Freeman, the journalist, had severe anorexia all throughout adolescence and spent, I think, like 6 years in and out of psychiatric care. And there's a really interesting part, because I'm always thinking about how do we loosen the grip of the ones who are already in there? How do you loosen the grip of this belief? And as the detransitioners have told me, many of them, they just they watched one Peter Boghossian video and then they just let it sit in their mind, and eventually they sought out more, or they listened to a TERF and they thought she was transphobic, but the idea lodged in their mind. And the Hadley Freeman, because it's anorexia, it's a parallel world, but it's very similar. She said that she was interviewing one of the experts who said very often the overvalued idea, the overvalued belief loosens its grip, definitely not because you're directly targeting it, but the person in the eating disorder ward, the anorexic who's starving herself, would overhear the nurses talking on a Friday afternoon about their plans for the weekend. And gradually the woman would think, I want to have plans on the weekend. I want to have a life beyond this. And that was the first crack, the belief, there's a crack in the belief, and there's another world out there. There's a real life that you could have if you just let this belief go. For Hadley Freeman, I think she says one of the major cracks for her was there was a 30-year-old anorexic at the table having a complete meltdown like a toddler over how much butter was on her toast. And Hadley Freeman had this, I don't want to be 30 years old and having a tantrum over toast. And the belief, there was a major crack in this belief that I need to starve myself. I cannot have an inch of fat on my body. And so it's not directly challenging the belief, but do you think that, and I know that they also tell parents are not to focus on the anorexia with their child. They're to just almost pretend that it doesn't exist and just act normal and it's no big deal, because if you focus on it and if you aggressively attack it, you entrench the belief and you entrench your child. So is there a way that parents can be those nurses talking about the weekend, or put cracks in the belief without the young person knowing? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what I specialize in, right? This is the conversation I have all week long, and I think that there are far more than those two options. And I think a lot of people come to me when they have tried either or both of those two options, right? One option being to directly attack the belief, oftentimes in a way that is quite naive to the function that that belief serves in that young person's life. And then no surprise that it doesn't go well, right? So that's one option. Another option is to completely ignore it, like you say, and just, as many people say, focus on the relationship, nurture the relationship, which I definitely believe in. But what does that mean? A lot of times people come to me because they've been trying to do that, and that's looked like being conflict avoidant, kicking the can down the road, walking on eggshells, enabling bad behavior, tolerating things that are not helping shape their child's character development, and just hoping the issue will go away. And oftentimes, these parents, they've done their research, they've read all the same things you and I have, maybe not all the same things, but they're like, well, gender dysphoria resolves on its own if you just leave it alone. It's like, yeah, well, that study, that was from a time in a different cultural environment. It's not going to go away on its own in our current cultural incentive and disincentive system. So, I don't think that nurturing the relationship, or, not directly targeting the issue, has to mean total conflict avoidance, has to mean codependent, dysfunctional, conflict avoidant relationships. I think sometimes working on the relationship without directly targeting the belief, but without not targeting it either, is really a matter of slowing down, attuning to what's happening, and picking up what your kid is putting down. And that's why I describe ROGD repair as an emotionally intelligent approach to parenting your way through this, because if you're slowing down and attuning to what's going on, kids are giving you all of these moments, right? There's a moment that they snap at you, or there's a flash of fear or a flash of guilt or some emotion, right? And what are you doing with that moment? Can you stop and acknowledge, okay, I saw that. Do you want to talk about it? Or I teach parents to make empathic guesses. People rely on questions too much. They think, that's the other advice. Oh, just ask, what does that mean to you? Why do you feel that way? Why do you think you feel that way? No, those aren't good questions. I mean, I do have a lesson in my course on using what and how questions rather than why questions, because those are less likely to provoke defensiveness. But when you're asking questions, you're letting the kid lead and you are overvaluing their insight. You're overestimating their insight. So what I do with my clients is we do the heavy lifting as the adults. And if you go through my course and you take their homework really seriously and you do the exercises in my program, you're basically mimicking the coaching process. You, as the adult, as the more emotionally intelligent person here, you do the heavy lifting of figuring out what this means to your child, mapping out their psyche, figuring out their association so that you can make intelligent empathic guesses, so that you can reframe what they're saying in a way that they feel heard, but you just interpreted it a slightly different angle. And that's the process by which you gradually untangle these knots in the brain. And that's what I teach parents to do.
That's putting the crack. So that's your way of putting. It's all about just putting little cracks in the belief, and then for some it's really fast. It just crumbles, and for others it can take years and years and years. But the doubts and the incoherencies, the inconsistencies, it all starts to add up, and eventually Stella's got that lovely analogy, adding pebbles to a bucket. I love that. Eventually the accumulated weight of the pebbles outweighs the hold the belief had.
And let me add a really important piece of this that I don't ever want anybody to miss this piece. It's about the part of your child that wants to desist. It's about helping the part of them that wants out of this. There is a part. So it's not about the cracks that you want to put in, right? So if you're a raging feminist TERF and you're so angry about men in women's prisons, like, I get it, okay? I'm with you, okay? But if that's not the area of cognitive dissonance that's most accessible for your child, figure out what is. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk about my work. I was talking about my work. Mia Hughes, it's so good to have you. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. By the way, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but if you're still listening and you want more of Mia's lovely phone book reading voice to put you to sleep, perhaps, put you to sleep while learning about gender issues, as she originally appeared on my podcast on episode 107, and I will link to that in the show notes. So Mia Hughes, where can people find you and all the things that you're up to?
I'm only active on Twitter, X, I suppose I should get used to calling it, but I can't. @_Crimea River. That's the only social media I have. Although I did just launch my Substack. I suppose I should plug that. It's the same, Crimea River, Mia spelled MIA. And there's one essay on there, which is a very personal one about my time in Taiwan and about change and the importance of open futures. I'm a co-host of Beyond Gender with Stella O'Malley and Brett Alderman, so you can find Beyond Gender on YouTube. My Canadian writing is on my MLI, my Macdonald-Laurier Institute page, and then I write for Genspect too. And keep a lookout for my academic paper, which I'm convinced will get published somewhere, but I think it's going to be a bit of a lengthy process there.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.